Bloody hell YouTube, what's going on? Tuner again here. First, I think this video needs an introduction, as this video is not going to be like the other content which will be uploaded on this channel in the future. This video is not for other anti-natalists, although it will be appreciated if anti-natalists can watch this video and give me feedback as to the points I made. This video is instead intended for natalists, as I believe arguing and discussing anti-natalism with other anti-natalists is fine and dandy as it expands our knowledge and improves our argument-making skills. It does not allow for the natalist to be swayed otherwise. In fact, this video is not only for natalists, but also for unphilosophical people. This is because natalism is a problem that affects everyone in the world. Anyone who has been born is a victim of childbirth. As such, I think everyone should be informed on the opinions and logic behind anti-natalism. Because of this, I will be making this video in a somewhat unphilosophical way, and I will be explaining the philosophical terms used in order to allow the general folk to get this. Please approach this video with an open mind, as philosophy is all about overcoming biases and using logic and reason to reach a conclusion. Emotions and society are very easy to influence you in the belief that childbirth is acceptable. This is because, biologically, we are driven to have children. Emotions are a biological response which has allowed us to survive. Without emotions, we would have died out. Without emotions, you would see a fellow man eat a poisonous berry, die, and then not be able to compute as to why it would be bad to eat that berry because you would not feel bad that he had died. So easily, having children has biological ground. However, that biological ground, I would argue, is not a good ground to stand on. Simply because rape is also very prominent in evolution as it allows an undesirable male to spread their genes, and yet we would agree that rape is wrong. I would hope, unless you are a moral nihilist. Negative utilitarianism is the belief that pleasure is of no value, and that suffering is the only thing that should be taken into account when considering morals. I think the legal system is based off of negative utilitarianism, simply because, look at rape, for example. A utilitarian believes that a certain amount of pleasure will outweigh a certain amount of suffering. Which would mean, if the rapist gets enough pleasure out of raping a victim, then that act could, to some extent, be classed as morally acceptable, because the pleasure gained outweighs the suffering experienced. Most of us would agree that rape is a negative. As such, it comes under the category of negative utilitarianism. Negative utilitarianism would say that it is bad because the victim experiences great suffering. It does not matter how much pleasure the rapist is getting, as long as the victim is suffering. Some negative utilitarians would go to the extent, myself included, that a pinprick is too much suffering to handle, simply because pleasure is of zero value, and as such, a pinprick has more value than all the suffering in the world. This may seem absurd to a lot of people, considering a lot of people like their lives. I love my life. My life is awesome. I'm very lucky and fortunate. This does not mean, however, that I cannot use logic and reason to understand that nothing can allow suffering to be reasonable. One example of this, and I saw this in a quote on the internet, which I really enjoyed, was, "We all try to avoid suffering in our lives, and we usually consider all acts which cause others to suffer immoral acts. If you don't consider suffering to be bad, then how can you justify causing suffering to be immoral?" A lot of people argue online and in person that suffering builds character. This I agree with. However, the value of the character building is another question to be answered. I would argue that it doesn't matter how much character is being built, non-existent would mean that the character building is not needed and therefore the suffering is pointless. In fact, some people do make this argument every single time anti-natalism is brought up. The quote continues, In fact, if suffering is good and provides meaning, then graciously inflicting suffering on others is morally permissible, or perhaps even a moral obligation. This is true, because if you believe suffering has some utility and is a positive value, then surely, by the same logic, and only a few steps, one could see that if you inflict pain and suffering on other people, you are building their character and therefore doing them a service. However, I think most people watching this video, or at least I hope, would agree that raping people is not acceptable, especially for the reasons of character building. You could not rape someone and say, hey, I bet you're a better person now. No, that's insane. I'm sure everyone watching this would be in agreement with that. And anyone who is in agreement with this, I'm sure, could be classified as a negative utilitarian. Now, negative utilitarianism tries to minimize suffering. That is the whole purpose of negative utilitarianism. So that brings us to the first argument for anti-natalism, which is the asymmetry argument put forth by David Benatar. The four processes of the asymmetry argument go like this. If a person exists, then pain is a bad thing. We all dislike pain and suffering. Not necessarily pain. Some people do find pleasure in pain. However, suffering is a better term to be used here. Suffering is always bad, regardless of the person. What classifies as suffering is completely subjective, but suffering is objectively negative. The second part. If a person exists, then pleasure is a good thing. This is simple and speaks for itself. If you're alive and I give you $1 million, you're going to feel really happy that you have that $1 million. However, if you don't exist, you won't care that you're not getting $1 million simply because you won't exist. This is why negative utilitarianism and anti-natalism go so hand in hand. Simply because, by this standard, the pleasure is completely irrelevant if you're non-existent. Negative utilitarians say all pleasure is non-existent, whether you exist or you don't. However, the suffering does matter, which is why the first point, pain is a bad thing if you exist, is so crucial. The third part, what does not exist cannot suffer. Therefore, non-existing pain is a good thing. This, once again, I feel speaks for itself. If you don't exist, you cannot be conscious of pain and suffering. So, the problem with natalism is you're bringing a child into the world which did not care about the lack of pleasure it was getting for the purpose so the child could get that pleasure, which it doesn't care about, while subjecting it to suffering which it would not have been subjected to previously, which it did not need to experience. The fourth part of this, and last part, is what does not exist cannot be deprived of any pleasure. Therefore, non-existing pleasure is not a bad thing. I mentioned this previously while discussing the second point. However, there is also the possibility of suffering to some minor extent to occur if a person is existent and the lack of pleasure is involved. It's not only suffering that causes a negative response, but the lack of a positive stimulus can also cause a negative response. There must be two things to be true for you to logically be an anti-natalist. According to the asymmetry argument, this is that accepting asymmetry is true. Do you believe that you will not care about pleasure if you don't exist? Do you believe that not having pleasure while existing can be a bad thing? Do you believe that if you're non-existent, suffering doesn't matter to you? Do you also believe that if you're born, you're able to experience suffering? I think the answer to all of these questions should be yes, which therefore you are halfway there to anti-natalism. The second principle, and only other principle you need to be an anti-natalist, is accepting the principle that creating harm is bad. This is why anti-natalism is so sound on its philosophy, simply because it has its grounding and its logic. Some arguments against antinatalism and this asymmetry argument comes from utilitarians. The utilitarians argue, as I mentioned before, that pleasure can justify pain. However, pain is always a bad thing. Even if it is essential for greater good to come out of it, suffering will always be a negative. This is undeniable. In fact, one could phrase it simpler by saying, a child's potential interests are not a reason to have a child. I'll stop right there for a second, as a child that has not been born yet does not have interests to be taken care of. Therefore, they do not care about the lack of their interests being fulfilled. This is a fact. I do not think you can refute this. The next part of this goes, it makes no sense to say a child's potential pleasures are a reason to have the child. This, as mentioned at least 2 other times in this video, is simple. A child that does not exist cannot desire pleasures. If you don't have a child, you prevent it from having desires. Therefore, their desires cannot go unfulfilled. Therefore, you are ridding the child of multiple forms of dissatisfaction and displeasure. Another premise of antinatalism is, it's not justifiable without another person's permission to put them in a position where they can suffer, regardless of whether or not that act can bring about great pleasure. Or, in fact, if this is the only way to experience pleasure. Would you rape someone and bring them a great deal of pain and misery if they got to eat a cookie afterwards? You may think that this is a not fair analogy to make about childbirth. However, I would argue that it is. Because realistically, you cannot argue against the fact that the possibility exists for that scale of pleasure to pain ratio to exist. There is a possibility that your child will get bone cancer when it's 3 years old. There is a possibility that it will get raped on a daily basis. There is also the possibility that you'll die before your child is born, and therefore you cannot argue, oh, well, I can ensure a good life for my child. Because you can simply not guarantee that you will be around to look after your child. And what was in that last quote was a very important part: consent. If we could speak to children before they were born and inform them of the pain and suffering that is possible in life, then and only then would it be justifiable to have children. However, I don't think you need to be a genius to work out a child that does not exist is not able to give its consent. Which is why antinatalists and antinatalism is against the principle of having children. Simply because you are forcefully bringing a child into a world which it was not in previously, with the knowledge that it will suffer. I have a David Benatar quote as my desktop wallpaper at the moment. I really do like this quote, and this quote goes, "It's curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all suffering of the children is not to bring their children into existence in the first place." That quote does speak for itself, I believe. So with this consent and the asymmetry argument, what else is there to discuss in this video? All good philosophers would know that philosophy is not about being right. Philosophy is about intelligent conversation and coming to the conclusion which is backed up by the most sound logic and reason. For this reason, I would argue that if a natalist puts forth a good pro-natalist argument, all anti-natalists would embrace this. At least as long as this argument was based on logic sound enough to counteract the logic of the anti-natalist arguments. I know I myself would not mind having children as long as there was a good reason for it. However, the reasons for having a child is generally, hey, it's a part of life and I would like to experience that part of life. I would like to raise a child so they can experience that part of life as well, which is a part of the problem, the continuous cycle. Some anti-natalists simply believe childbirth is wrong. I believe childbirth is the worst thing. simply because you cannot know how much pain and suffering one child will have, let alone that children's children and that children's children. It's a never-ending cycle, so essentially, by having a child, you are spawning the possibility of an infinite amount of suffering to exist. For what reason? Your individual pleasure. If you're an anti-natalist, or at least a negative utilitarian, you'll understand that the pleasure you get from the child simply does not matter when you take into consideration any amount of suffering which the child will feel, which is inevitable when you have a child. So what are some arguments against anti-natalism? As I said, philosophers need to discuss both sides of the argument. And some of the arguments that I hear frequently are, well, that would, of course, lead to the extinction of the human species. This, of course, is a bad argument, as it is saying that the extinction of the human species is objectively a bad thing. Which it may sound funny that I'm saying that the extinction of the human species isn't a bad thing. But what I'm meaning by that is, why would the extinction of the human species be a negative thing? If you can give me one objective reason in the comment section below as to why the extinction of the human species would be a negative, I will suck on your genitals. With that being said, the extinction of the human species, or in fact any species or all species, would be beneficial, because that would then prevent any suffering that species could possibly encounter in the future. Not only this, but I think one reason this argument is made so frequently is that extinction hasn't been done voluntarily before. As such, extinction is generally seen as a bad thing because murder is involved. A species will be fed upon and preyed upon until that species dies out. All anti-natalists, or at least a majority of anti-natalists, I won't speak for everyone here, are against the murder of people. Negative utilitarians can have some hypothetical scenarios in which logic would dictate you should kill people or everybody. However, that is another story for another video. What I'm speaking about here is that anti-natalism within itself is simply the voluntary extinction of the human species by not having children. This means that there is no negative to come about the extinction of the human species. It will not be like other species which have been preyed upon to their extinction, as we will have full control over it. The only way that we could possibly have a reason to have children, and I have had this argument be made, is what if the world is a utopia? Now this is a hypothetical. If we're being real here, there is no possibility of utopia existing within our lifetimes or your children's lifetimes. With this being said, in the hypothetical in which case the world is a utopia, there is no reason not to have a child, and I agree with that. However, anti-natalism is not about, hey, how much suffering can we avoid? It's, we don't want any suffering. I do apologize for the darkness in this video, as the clouds outside were starting to get darker. The quality and lighting in this video would be better otherwise. Thank you for watching though. I do hope you learned something today. If I have even slightly changed any of your opinions, please let me know, because this is the reason why I do this. Have a lovely night, and peace out.